What was Solly really trying to pull with this policy directive to ICASA? It seems like a simple administrative move on the surface aimed at maybe relaxing the equity requirements for foreign internet providers. But when you look closer, it raises serious questions about intent, process, and consequences. The minister's directive directly conflicts with Section 9, subsection 2, paragraph B of the Electronic Communications Act, which mandates a minimum of 30% historically disadvantaged equity ownership for network services licenses. That is not a guideline or a suggestion, it is law. Spectrum is a national resource and it underpins everything from mobile networks to emergency services. Allowing someone to bypass these requirements without cabinet approval, without the regulators backing, and without public consultation is more than an overreach. It undermines both the Constitution and Parliament's oversight function. It isn't just a policy decision either. This is a move that could redirect billions in economic value offshore while weakening local ownership and control. And we have to ask why this happened now after repeated committee discussions emphasizing the importance of transformation. Why attempt to bypass a law that has been in place to protect the country's sovereign assets and ensure equitable participation in the ICT sector? The timing and the secrecy and the unilateral action all suggest that there is more at play than simply accelerating broadband rollout or promoting investment. We have to look at the incentives here. Starlink and other foreign providers stand to gain enormous advantages if this directive is ever enforced. They could enter the South African market with minimal local investment, minimal local ownership, and still control critical infrastructure and spectrum. The Electronic Communications Act was written specifically to prevent foreign entities from dominating a strategic sector without meaningful local participation. If Solly's directive went through, it would effectively rewrite these safeguards without parliamentary approval. That means billions in economic gains could be extracted offshore while the communities the law was designed to protect remain disconnected, under-resourced, and vulnerable. The minister might argue that this is about investment and connectivity, but the trade-off is massive. Equity and transformation are not minor inconveniences. They are constitutional imperatives. Every time a historically disadvantaged group is excluded from ownership or management, the gap in economic opportunity widens. Voluntary compliance has already failed in the private sector. This directive, if it's allowed, signals that legal protections for equity can be sidestepped whenever it suits investors or whenever someone in power wants to bend the rules. And that sets a dangerous precedent. One decision could weaken decades of carefully constructed frameworks aimed at redressing systematic inequalities, all under the guise of policy innovation. It is important to ask whether the minister has the moral or legal authority to make this call alone, and the answer is clear, he does not. Then there is the question of process. This wasn't a consultation with Parliament. It wasn't approved by Cabinet. ICASA, the regulator, was instructed to comply, even though it is meant to act independently. So that is a breach of due process. Laws exist for a reason. The Electronic Communications Act is clear. If changes are needed, amendments must go through proper legislative channels. Courts exist to resolve disputes on interpretation. Instead, we see a minister trying to shortcut these mechanisms to create a new pathway for foreign companies without the checks and balances that protect national interests. When due process is ignored, the consequences are real. Spectrum is finite, it is strategic and incredibly valuable. Allowing unregulated access for foreign providers could undermine local operators. It could weaken public service obligations and reduce the potential for South Africans to meaningfully participate in one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy. It has less to do with about money, but more to do with control, influence, and sovereignty. It's about whether South Africa retains the ability to govern its own digital future, or whether it allows powerful outsiders to dictate terms under the banner of progress or connectivity. Every step that bypasses legislation chips away at the foundation of democracy. It raises the stakes for everyone, for citizens, businesses, and state owned entities who rely on the integrity of these laws to function effectively. What concerns me more is the pattern. Solly has previously shown a disregard for due process. So this is not a one off incident. Repeated committee meetings, written concerns, and public discourse have been ignored or sidelined. Transformation, redress, and equity have been framed as negotiable when in fact they are mandatory. Every unilateral directive that sidesteps these obligations erodes public trust. Citizens are watching, businesses are watching, and international investors are watching at how seriously South Africa upholds its laws. When a minister tries to make unilateral changes to entrenched law without oversight, it is not just a procedural lapse, it's a statement about priorities. Does the minister prioritize democratic processes, equity, and national control? Or does he prioritize expediency and foreign investment over public interest? Hmm? If equity and transformation can be bypassed so easily, what prevents similar measures in other strategic sectors? The implications here are enormous. Laws exist to protect citizens, to ensure fairness, and to prevent the extraction of wealth from vulnerable communities. Ignoring them for the benefit of foreign investors risks the very gains that democracy and BE programs were built to secure. It also undermines the sustainability of initiatives like SAPO, which serve rural and underserved communities. Decisions that compromise these institutions are not neutral. They have immediate and measurable impacts on access, on opportunity, and equity across the country. It is also worth examining the justification he used. Solly claims that the directive is about accelerating broadband rollout or promoting investment and aligning regulatory frameworks with the ICT sector code. On the surface, those objectives sound reasonable, but they ignore the fundamental purpose of existing laws. Equity and transformation are not secondary, they are core. Relaxing requirements for foreign providers does not automatically result in more connectivity for the people who need it the most. The truth is that infrastructure alone cannot create equity. 500 million rand in so called equity equivalent investment, even if it reaches a few thousand schools, cannot replace meaningful local ownership or managerial participation and skill development. Without these elements, the benefits remain superficial. It's like charity. Communities remain dependent on foreign companies, and economic gains are extracted instead of being circulated locally. That is why Kusela and her committee pushed back. The directive is not a policy innovation, it is a loophole. It undermines decades of struggle for redress, and it prioritizes investor convenience over the public interest. There is, there is no shortcut for justice. There is no way to bypass constitutional principles without consequences. When ministers attempt this, the people who bear the cost are ordinary South Africans, be it students, teachers, and rural communities who deserve access to both connectivity and opportunity, not just a free Wi Fi box that may arrive in a dusty depot and sit unused for years. That is the problem with shortcuts. They look good on paper, but they fail in reality, and history will hold us accountable for ignoring the law under the pretext of expediency. We also have to consider precedent. If this directive is allowed to stand, it opens the door for future investors and ministers to treat laws as flexible suggestions rather than mandatory safeguards. Spectrum is a sovereign asset, just like minerals, just like water. It should not be handed over to foreign entities under terms that favor outside profits over local ownership. Laws around equity ownership exist to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. Every regulatory bypass sets a dangerous signal to other sectors that strategic resources can be manipulated, that transformation is optional, and that public oversight can be ignored. That is why the pushback from Parliament is critical. Protecting the letter and spirit of the law is not about slowing down investment. It's about ensuring investment aligns with national priorities instead. The role of the minister is to uphold the law, not circumvent it. If this principle is lost, we risk the systemic weakening of South Africa's digital infrastructure and the economic empowerment of the very people these policies were designed to benefit. Citizens and civil society must remain vigilant. Ministers should be reminded constantly that their mandate is not to make the law, but to implement it. Deviating from this responsibility, intentionally or otherwise, jeopardizes not only the equity in the ICT sector, but the credibility of democratic institutions more broadly. Every decision made in the name of progress must still respect legal boundaries and the constitutional right to economic participation for all historically disadvantaged groups. And at the end of the day, what we are seeing is more than just policy dispute. This is a test of whether South Africa can defend its laws, of whether South Africa can defend its sovereignty and its commitment to transformation. Solly's actions raise real questions about priorities and accountability and adherence to due process. The Portfolio Committee's response, led by Kusela, reminds us why checks and balances exist and why Parliament must remain vigilant. If citizens, lawmakers, and advocates do not stand firm, we risk allowing foreign companies to enter critical sectors without contributing meaningfully to local ownership or community development. That is not just a bad policy. It is a threat to our democratic integrity. Laws are not optional. Transformation is non-negotiable. Equity is not a hurdle to be bypassed for investor convenience. And ministers who try to override these protections must be held accountable. South Africa has worked too hard and fought for too long and sacrificed too much to allow shortcuts that compromise decades of progress. Watching this unfold should motivate everyone invested in this country's future to engage, to question, and to demand adherence to the law. Equity is not a favor. It is a right, and it must be defended every single day.